Buenas noches, Chile!
This is some of the immense crowd that greeted his victory in Chile's capital, Santiago.
The Anti-Defamation League is not really discussed as a neoconservative organization, and I think it's just a historical oversight.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. On September 11th, in Chile in 1973, General Pinochet and his fascist friends overthrew the government of Salvador Allende. Jose Cast, candidate of the far right in this year's Chilean presidential election, made no secret of his sympathy for Pinochet. In the first round of the election, things looked terrible for the left. Their candidate came in second, but he only had 1/4 of the vote. Yet on December 20th, the left candidate Gabriel Boric won in a landslide.
Buenas noches, Chile!
This is some of the immense crowd that greeted his victory in Chile's capital, Santiago. It was the fruit of what the left called the revolution of 2019.
Pueblos que habitan el lugar que llamamos Chile.
This is Gabriel Boric. He's the president-elect of Chile. He's only 35 years old. 10 years ago, he was a far-left student leader on campus. And this is music from Chile in 2019, an orchestra and a crowd singing, "The people united will never be defeated." Predictably, the Jerusalem Post chimed in and said Chilean Jews were worried because of Boric's anti-Zionism. Yet, as Vincent Bevins pointed out in a tweet, the article in the Post doesn't quote a single Jew from Chile. It's typical Zionist Hasbara propaganda. Now, a video and some photos from Sudan, where tens or hundreds of thousands of Sudanese took to the streets to mark the 3rd anniversary of the overthrow of the last dictator while they struggled against the military coup.
ديسمبر الأسرى الجمهوري 19 ديسمبر الأسرى الجمهوري إعلام حزب المؤتمر السوداني.
Look at our website where there's a resolution that trade union members are circulating to get support for the Sudanese working for democracy. Now, a quick look back at past stories we've covered. The Kellogg workers have gone back to work, ended their strike after they were able to get the company to up their offer. And if you recall, I had wondered on camera whether there was a boycott of Hyundai cars. There is, through the BDS movement, a boycott of Hyundai heavy machines because of their use by the Israelis to smash Palestinian houses. So I inquired, and BDS leader Omar Barghouti replied that Hyundai had been split up some years ago and that the auto company is separate from the division that makes the heavy machines that destroy homes. And so there's no boycott of Hyundai cars. Again, save the date January 16th for a Zoom panel on the effects of climate change on public health. The speakers will be Laura Bazzi from the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, Leticia de Mejias, who is best known for her work on using energy efficiency, and Earl McWilliams, who has been warning about the now hopefully dead climate fracked gas plant. Now back to the forum that was held about the Anti-Defamation League some weeks ago on Zoom. Dr. Emmaia Gelman, who's an expert about the ADL, had been talking about the history of the group. Here she talks about the ADL and how in the 70s it started saying that criticism of Israel was anti-Semitic.
So in 1974, the ADL published a book. The two directors of the ADL published a book called The New Anti-Semitism. And you may recognize the term, the new anti-Semitism, because we hear about the new anti-Semitism every 5 seconds now. There's always a new anti-Semitism. That was the first time. So in 1974, they published a book called The New Anti-Semitism, which identified for the first time, didn't quite identify anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, although it did note that Jewish leftists were mistakenly aligning themselves with the left and against Israel. The argument that it specifically made was that now that Jews, and this is not my language, I want to be clear, this is the language of the ADL. Now that Jews had become bourgeois, or the establishment rather, now that Jews had become the establishment, and now that there was so much pushback on the establishment, it had become okay. People had sort of started to think that it was okay to denounce or push back on what they were calling Jewish interests, by which they specifically meant Israel, because those were establishment interests. And so rather than understanding them as Jewish interests, they were being seen as establishment interests. And so people felt okay denouncing those interests, and that was anti-Semitism. So the ADL was saying, like, they were trying to say that even though they were trying to say that as if Jewish interests are establishment interests, then pushing back on establishment interests is anti-Semitism. So the first kernel of this idea that you can't push back on a state, you can't push back on a militarist state without actually being anti-Semitic. And that 1974 was the beginning of that argument, and they pursue it and they sort of elevate it and refine it as they go through their work. I don't want to take up too much more time. It is really hard to talk about the history of the ADL because it's been so submerged. There's so much that's there. There's no shorthand for this because none of it is discussed, right? So I'll just put a few pins down, and we can come back to them if you like. One is that at that time, from beginning in 1967, the ADL actually the birth of the neoconservative movement is around there, right? There's an earlier set of Marxists who swerve right, this sort of city college Marxists who swerve right in response to Stalin, and then there's a second set of socialists who swerve right in response to the emergence of the new left. They swerve right because they want to support the Vietnam War and anti-communism, and the student movement is opposing anti-communism. That second set of leftists who swerve right fans out into the American Enterprise Institute, into JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security, whatever A is, and into other organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League is not really discussed as a neoconservative organization, and I think it's just a historical oversight. So if you want to talk more about neoconservatism, I would be happy to do that. The ADL spying scandal, which was briefly in 1993, the ADL was revealed to have been spying itself on organizations, leftist organizations, sort of a wide range, I think something like 6,000 organizations and 10,000 individuals, and to have bought police files, police surveillance files that were also supposed to have been destroyed because they were deemed unconstitutional. The ADL was found to have been spying, and there was a big deal made out of it, and they said, well, we just do surveillance because we're just trying to sort of make sure everything is okay. And that kind of disappeared when the ADL said they wouldn't do it anymore. I don't know, it was a lawsuit. It looks to me as if the ADL was spying on organizations that neoconservative organizations and the CIA were also trying to repress. If you'd like to talk more about that, I would love to. The second piece of information that I'll put out there is that the hate crimes laws, which are now coming back into conversation, particularly in relation to white nationalists and attacks on Asian Americans, attacks on Jews. Hate crimes laws were a very specific project of the Anti-Defamation League. The short version is that in 1979 and 1980, when in a moment somewhat similar to the present, when white nationalist attacks were on the rise, violence was being organized, the Klan was on the rise, there was legislation at the state level that was intended to try and redress really catastrophic violence particularly against Black people being burned out of their homes, against Asian people being murdered because people were angry about the offshoring of jobs, really like intense, catastrophic, life-threatening violence. At the same time, the Anti-Defamation League had been interested in trying to pass legislation that was more about symbolic violence, like drawing of swastikas and stuff like that. And they hadn't really had any luck. In about 1980, they figured out that they could put the two together. They could put the desecration of gravestones, for example, together in legislation about arson on the basis of race. And that together, they could be called racial and religious violence, and they could move through the states. And that's the basis of hate crimes legislation. It was a deliberate effort to conflate like catastrophic, lethal racial violence with other kinds of violence, or other kinds of sort of anti-Semitic intent that was not the same kind of violence, for the purpose of flattening the two, making them sort of the same. I would say also diminishing the content of anti-Black violence and elevating anti-Semitism to a sort of panic level where it could leverage more interest than it did before. I don't think the ADL understood how powerful that would be, but it certainly came to understand later. And we're seeing the impacts of that today. So the ADL sort of built an empire on that hate crimes work, and it persists into the present. The last thing I'll say before I be quiet is that the ADL has become very wise. So you saw the photo of Jonathan Greenblatt. He's the new CEO of the ADL for the last couple of years. He's very savvy, and he has helped the ADL sort of morph in response to its critics. So whereas the ADL has been charged with being Islamophobic and being racist increasingly, in the last couple of months, it has absolutely wiped from its website its Islamophobic content. It has wiped from its website its concerns about Black identity extremism, and it's almost exclusively, all the public content you can find about it now is almost exclusively focused on January 6th insurrection and white nationalism. That doesn't mean it's not doing the other work. What it is indicative of is that the ADL is trying to preserve its progressive bona fides by masking the other work that it does. There's tons of Freedom of Information Act work going on, particularly by Palestinian Youth Movement and Stop LAPD Spying. They're just doing enormous research and FOIA requests on the ADL. The ADL is working with the FBI, trying to recategorize what domestic violent extremism means, meaning domestic terror, so that it equates white nationalists with Black Lives Matter activists. That work is still going on. The ADL is sort of doing diffuse work to push back on ethnic studies curriculum in California. And I think primarily what we need to understand is that it changes its format in order to be able to keep doing the work that it's doing in response to criticism.
Also at the same event, we heard from Jewish Voice for Peace leader Shelly Altman talk about how this ADL, which was supposed to be defending the reputation of Jews, was all involved with taking U.S. police to Israel for training.
What I'm going to talk about, it turns out, without any planning in advance really, is my talk is really a data point in your talk. And I think we'll see or so many of the characteristics of the ADL that you've talked about over the years. We see them in the Deadly Exchange campaign, and also the Deadly Exchange that ADL is fighting. So I'm sure most or all of you here are probably familiar with what the Deadly Exchange is to some level to some degree, but I'd like to set the context for what it is, so that we can then compare what the ADL is saying about it and what has happened with regard to the police exchanges. So the Deadly Exchange is a national grassroots campaign focused on ending U.S.-Israel police exchanges, and these exchanges are primarily led by nonprofit organizations such as the ADL. They whitewash Israel's human rights abuses and strengthen the violent systems of policing in the U.S. and in Palestine and Israel. The exchange programs bring together police, ICE, Border Patrol, and FBI from the US with soldiers, police, border agents from Israel. In the programs, worst practices are shared to promote and extend discriminatory and repressive policing in both countries. These include, and these should be very familiar from what you were just saying, racial profiling, massive spying and surveillance, deportation and detention, and attacks on human rights defenders. All of these offenses are committed daily by the state of Israel against Palestinian residents of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and within the state of Israel itself. As I'm sure all of you know, Israel last month designated 6 human rights organizations operating in the West Bank as, quote, terrorist. And just this month, it became known that Israel has used the Pegasus spyware on these organizations and their staffs. Pegasus, developed by the Israeli cyber arms company NSO, is used to monitor text messages, track calls, collect passwords, track location, access microphones and cameras, and harvest information from apps. The Israelis have also raided the physical offices of the organizations. So there's a really terrific report on Deadly Exchange, which I'll share later, but and also there's a database of where these police exchanges have occurred. I'll also share that. But I'd like to switch now from what the Deadly Exchange is and the awful stuff that the Deadly Exchange is, that the campaign is fighting against, to what the ADL says about the Deadly Exchange. And the ADL has what's called a hate glossary, which is being distributed as part of their Shine a Light on Anti-Semitism campaign that's been going on around Hanukkah. The ADL used to have the police exchange programs front and center on its website, but no more. They've scrubbed that from their website, just like they've scrubbed other stuff that they really don't want to talk about it anymore. I guess they're think it's probably not something to brag about now that the Deadly Exchange campaign has sort of made public what this is all about. So in the glossary, under the definition of deadly exchange, there's a paragraph that says, when it's anti-Semitic. And this is a quote from the glossary. The deadly exchange trope directly compares US police actions against Black Americans with the Israeli Defense Forces treatment of Palestinians. Believers in the, quote, deadly exchange, unquote, alleged, quote, worst practices are shared between US and Israeli armed forces. Users of the trope argue Israel and US law enforcement exchange security practices and ideologies to purposely target people of color. This false equivalence appeared in demonstrations in the summer of 2020 when protesters chanted, Israel, we know you, you murder children too. This is categorically false. I'll say it again, Israel, the ADL is saying it's categorically false that Israel murders children. Accusing Israel or Zionists of complicity in the murder of Black people is malicious, perpetrates anti-Semitism, and blames Jews for societal ills. And that's the end of the quote from the glossary. And I'll address the anti-Semitism charge shortly. Once again, Emmaia, you talked about in detail. There's some more to say about that here as well. But first, I wanted to look at three brief case studies of the deadly exchange. So the first case is Northampton, Massachusetts, and Vermont, the state of Vermont. In the fall of 2018, the ADL solicited police departments in New England to join an exchange delegation to take place in December. At least a couple of departments in Western Mass, I think the University of UMass Amherst and the county in which Springfield is located, declined to participate. But Northampton initially agreed to send its police chief. When this was discovered by JVP Western Mass, social justice groups quickly formed a coalition and secured a meeting with the mayor and with the police chief. And following significant additional pressure from community leaders, the mayor and the police chief agreed to withdraw, agreeing that the exchange was not in Northampton's best interest. And in the state of Vermont, one of the officers in the state police was going to attend, and a similar set of activities took place in reaction to the plan for Vermont to participate. And in this case, the police withdrew after a skip the trip campaign that was mounted by Vermonters for Justice in Palestine. And some of you might be aware that Vermonters for Justice in Palestine is the same organization that worked on Ben & Jerry's for years and finally got Ben & Jerry's to withdraw selling from in the settlements in the West Bank. Switching to the city of Seattle. In Seattle, the End the Deadly Exchange campaign launched a huge campaign to end police exchange programs. And in September, the city council voted 5-4 against terminating the exchanges. So they unfortunately did not, just by one vote, we lost that campaign for now. The campaign apparently had very strong support from Seattle's Jewish community, which is really encouraging. And now we switch to New Haven, where the story is somewhat different. In 2017, then New Haven Police Chief Anthony Campbell went on an ADL trip. Upon return, he made a private report back to the Jewish Federation in New Haven, in Woodbridge, Connecticut, not open to the general public that was paying his salary. Following a protest of his trip at a Hanukkah vigil by the Jewish Havaran Mending Minyan, with which JVP New Haven is closely allied, the Greater New Haven Arts Council writer Lucy Gelman reached Campbell by phone. Campbell called the seminar, quote, by far one of the most profound and life-changing experiences I've ever had. And I continue the quote, if it were up to me, every police chief in the country should have to take this counterterrorism seminar, unquote. So it's interesting to say the least that both Campbell and the ADL framed this as a counterterrorism seminar, while the state with which they're in partnership with considers human rights organizations as terrorist. So one can only conclude that the very intent of the exchanges is to subvert the movements for human rights wherever they are.
We have to note the news about this ex-football player who committed several murders and killed himself. His family had his brain scanned and found it was damaged by CTE, which has destroyed the lives of so many other ex-football athletes. News about a far right member of the Israeli parliament, Ben-Gvir, who has proposed that the Israeli authorities assassinate Israeli Arab citizens as revenge for attacks on the West Bank. He was also photographed in a garage underneath the Knesset, pulling a gun on a security guard because he was an Arab and had asked him to move his car from a prohibited space. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.